I love you.
You almost got us killed. Are you brainless?
I speak.
The ability to speak does not make you intelligent. Now get out of here.
No, Mr. Stay. Mr. called Jar Jar Binks. Mr. your humble servant.
That won't be necessary.
Oh, but it is. 'Tis demanded by the gods, it is.
Stay down.
You saved my again.
What's this?
A local. Let's get out of here before more droids show up.
More? More did you speak? Excuse me, but the most safest place would be Gonga City. It's where I grew up. 'Tis a hidden city.
City.
Uh-huh.
Can you take us there?
On second thought? No, not really, no.
No.
It's embarrassing. But, my friend might have been banished. Might forgotten. The bosses would do terrible things to me. Terrible things to me if me going back there.
You hear that?
Yeah?
That is the sound of 1,000 terrible things heading this way.
If they find us, they will crush us, grind us into tiny pieces, and blast us into oblivion.
Ah. Your point is well seen. This way. Hurry!
Welcome, Masters and Padawans, to episode 560 of Full of Sith. It's me, Bryan Young. Another special episode for you this evening. I have another one of the interviews from my archives commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Phantom Menace. This is an interview I did a few years ago for my oral history of the Phantom Menace, this time with animation director Rob Coleman. Rob was really the mastermind behind Jar Jar Binks and, they were the mastermind behind the computer graphics and the effects and the character animation behind the prequels. And, I think he doesn't get enough credit in the world of, animation for really building motion capture to get it to where we needed it to be in the space where we could get Gollum. I think Andy Serkis tends to get a lot of that credit, but really it should go to Rob Coleman and Ahmed Best. So without further ado, here's that interview.
So I got there in '93. I then moved up through the ranks. I was a supervising animator on a film called Dragonheart, which we found out later Lucas was watching from afar. He was not around ILM at the time. He was raising his young adopted kids in the early 90s. So we only saw him really at Christmas parties and things like that and 4th of July picnics. Apparently, and I found out this later, that he was watching from up at Skywalker what we were doing, in particular about Dragonheart, and then specifically, as it related to me, the work that I was supervising on the first Men in Black. And so I got a call from Jim Morris. He runs Pixar now, but he was running ILM at the time, to come to his office and have a chat about heading over to London to meet George Lucas. Now, I'd worked for the company for 4 years by this point, but I'd never really had a conversation with George. I'd sort of, there were pleasantries and hello and things like that, but nothing, no real conversation. Mm-hmm. So they told me that I would be heading over to London. Phantom Menace was in pre-production at that point at Leavesden, north of London. And that I was going to have a 10-day interview with George. That I was to shadow George, I was to be quiet, I was only to talk to him when he talked to me, and that he would get a feeling about me. He knew about my work, and he got a good recommendation, obviously, from Jim and senior management at ILM, but and they thought that my personality would click with him, but they would not commit until I'd had this opportunity. So there I was, somewhat freaked out of my head, that I was sitting with George, or sitting behind George, really. But I knew a lot about, him and obviously his previous films. And in particular, I knew that he was a fan of animation, and specifically a fan of the National Film Board of Canada. Now, I had studied animation under the National Film Board of Canada animators. That was in Montreal, Canada. And I knew that he had that, that he was when he started off in film school, he admired a lot of the Film Board films, both they have a documentary side and an animation side. So when he finally turned to me, and on whatever day that was, day 3, let's say, he said, well, what's your story? And I said, I've been at the company now for 4 years, and previously I'm from Toronto, and I studied with the National Film Board of Canada. And sure enough, he's like, you did what? And I said, yeah, I studied with the Film Board. He's like, hey, you move up here, talk to me. So that's when we started to connect. So in doing my homework, I knew that, and I'd read every article. There was a book that I'd picked up that had all his collected interviews from the early 70s. So, his work on American Graffiti and THX 1138, things like that. So I knew a lot. I'd read it, so I knew, I wanted to do my homework. So when it came time to actually chat with him, I could talk with some, I was coached not to be a fanboy. That was number one. Back then, there were no fanboys allowed in ILM. I was a fan, obviously, of the film, and it inspired me to go into this career, but you were not to be, fawning all over him, or I never asked him for an autograph, my entire time working with him, that kind of thing. So, I approached it that way, and it worked. So at the end of the 10 days, Rick McCallum, who was the producer on the film, took me aside and said, okay, you got the job. And at that point, that's when I started to really, the bottom fell out of my stomach, and I was like, oh my God, what have I done? We had all heard about the fabled other trilogies. So George had actually said back at some point in the 80s, I think, that there was 9 films. There were 3 that we got to see in 77, 80, and 83. And now here it was 1997. And I was now being put into an important role on that film to bring the next one to the big screen, and that's when I started to worry and self-doubt myself on whether I'd there's some proverb that says, "Be careful what you wish for." You might actually get it. So that's how I entered the Phantom Menace. We're working with George.
Coming in as animation director, and I believe you were the first person at ILM with the title animation director, right?
I was, yeah.
Coming in and then looking at how much animation there was to be done on the film, how do you look up that mountain?
That's you're actually giving me goosebumps here, because that was truly looking at that Mount Everest, we'll call it Mount Everest, and I couldn't see the top of it in that analogy. There was so much work, and to give you a comparison, as I entered the production phase on Phantom Menace, the previous show I'd supervised was Men in Black, and we had 200 shots, visual effects, animated shots in that film. They were projecting at the early stage of Phantom Menace there would be 2,000 shots. So it was in a magnitude beyond my ability to even process it. My first step into doing it was I really felt strongly that I needed to get some, we'll call it wins on the board, some home runs. And in reading the script and looking at the designs, I immediately had an affection, or I knew how we were going to handle Watto. I could just see him. I could just see him in my head. I could act him out myself. Andy Seacombe did a brilliant job with the voice, but I could imagine how he would move and how he would fly and things like that. So I set the task for the team that we would start with that, and I remember showing the early shots to George, and he was really, really pleased. He later showed them to Frank Oz, who was also very complimentary, because on the first, in the original version of Phantom Menace, Yoda was a puppet, which Frank did. He was later replaced by my team and I. But for the release, the initial release of the film, Frank was very much involved in puppeteering Yoda for that film, and so he was shown what George was telling him was the next generation of character work that could be done digitally, and we did that with Watto, and we kind of. Once I got that, I could have a little bit of a sigh of relief and go, okay. And then we took on some of the more complicated characters. And in those early days, I've told this story many times, but there was a sentence in the script that we couldn't even do for 6 months. And that sentence was, the Gungan army marches out to battle, period. That was over 6 months of work. We had no crowd system. We had no ability to put that many characters on the screen at a time. And week after week after week went by in us, we, as the creative management of the team, talking to the technical brilliant geniuses about, when are we going to get that tool and when can we do that? And there's no possible way we can hand place all those characters. And as the months went on, we would have a Wednesday lunch meeting, the visual effects supervisors, the producer, and myself. And the number one item on the agenda every day is, can we get the movie done? And for many, many months, the answer was no. We don't have the technology. We don't have the talent. We don't have the manpower. It was it was a worrying time. But George had faith in us, and we, this was ILM. We were never going to back down. We were going to figure it out. And there were jokes at that time, because of course it's industrial light and magic. We used to call it industrial light and brute force. Like, we would just brute. There was no frickin' magic. It was like we got to figure this out. And ultimately, of course, we did.
So there's a moment in the documentary at the beginning that came out with the Phantom Menace DVD where there's some consternation between, do we animate Jar Jar with Ahmed in the suit and just replace his head, or do we use the blank plates and animate him completely? And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you made that determination and sort of what you were thinking as you were reporting this to George, who seemed a little, maybe a little annoyed. At least that's the sense I got watching the documentary.
I haven't seen that documentary in a long, long time, but what I'll tell you is what I remember. And the initial plan was, and you can see it from the behind-the-scenes footage, they had Ahmed in that full suit right up to his neck, and then he had a headpiece with eyes on it so the actors would look at the eyes. But the idea, and you'll see little green LEDs or little green lights around his neck. The initial plan was, and this is prior to my involvement in the film, was that Ahmed was going to perform the body, and that ILM was going to attach the neck and head. We would be tracking him frame by frame through the entire film. And we did do the first tests. They shot some test footage and they sent it to ILM from London, and we started to do that. And what we found out was that tracking it in 3 space, meaning distance from camera, Z, and X and Y up and down, was very, very hard and very time consuming. And even it being off just a sliver, just a couple of pixels, you would see a disconnect. You wouldn't believe that the head and neck were following along with Ahmed, that Ahmed's movement was so complicated that it was really, really difficult. And we were told we have to solve this. So at that point, I could see that this was going to be laborious to do it. So I asked, I should put a sidebar. We knew that we were going to have a full digital Jar Jar for shots that were too dangerous for Ahmed to do, for digital double work. So we already had that in the pipeline. So I then asked one of my most senior animators, and I think it was a guy named Lou De La Rosa, who ended up being the Jar Jar animation lead, to follow frame by frame what Ahmed was doing with his entire body, but have the freedom to animate it completely. And so what we did was we created a side-by-side. We showed George the tracking, and we showed the fully animated. We told him how long it took to do the tracking, which was longer than the fully animated one, because Lou wasn't, tied to counter-animating the neck and the head. And internally, we felt that the fully animated one was a better result. So George, I don't remember him being irritated. I think him being more, I'll use the word nervous or cautious, because he was afraid, I think, and this is 20 years back, but I think he was concerned that we didn't have the chops, that we wouldn't be able to animate him in the way that Ahmed was moving. And this, if I remember this correctly, this then prompted a guy named Jeff Light to come to me and say, I need to tell you about motion capture. So that's how we ended up down the motion capture route, because George had said, look, I cast Ahmed because of what he can do physically and what I saw him do in a show called Stomp, and I don't want to lose any of that. And so Jeff and his team in the motion capture group started putting together tests to illustrate to George that we could actually put Ahmed into a mocap suit, we could capture his physical performance, and we could then apply that to the fully digital model. And that's where we ended up.
In those early days of motion capture, how difficult was that, sort of bringing that to the table? I mean, it sounds like basically what you were doing was George was saying, we're going to do something impossible, and you all just throwing every tool you could at it until it didn't seem so impossible. Yeah, I mean, I think that was the ILM attracted the kind of people that love to problem solve and to be creative and honest in terms of, let's uncover overturn any rock, anything. Let's look at any way. Let's think outside of the box. Let's really put our brains together and consider our options. And then we pitched those ideas to George. And sometimes he believed that we could do it, and sometimes he said, you guys aren't ready yet. Like, for example, there was zero discussion about a digital Yoda in Phantom Menace as the film was starting. George felt that character was too precious, and so did I, quite frankly. I would have freaked out if I'd been asked to do Yoda for Phantom Menace. But in learning everything I learned on Phantom Menace and seeing what we could do in terms of, building the characters, rigging the characters, rendering the characters, performing the characters, that's how I got to a place where I then pitched George on doing a digital Yoda for all of Attack of the Clones. Now, initially, it was going to be, for the acting scenes, it was going to be a puppet, but for the fight with Dooku, it was going to be fully digital. So he'd committed to, I want to see Yoda fighting, I want to see him running around, I need to see his legs, and therefore it can't be a puppet. But then I pitched him, and I know we're getting off Phantom Menace here for a second, but so I pitched him that we could handle the acting shot. So that was, now going back to Phantom Menace, that was always his concern, was that we had not demonstrated him that we had the acting skills, and that's why he wanted to retain Ahmed's performance for Jar Jar, both physically and verbally, and that we were to be the I'll call it the puppeteers behind, but we were to use Ahmed completely, which I was on board with, absolutely, 100%. There's no way, it would take us so long to do what Ahmed could do in real time. Trying to figure out the technology in terms of how many cameras do we need. So you were talking about how George had felt that you weren't ready on Phantom Menace necessarily for anything like Yoda, and you'd proposed to do Yoda for Attack of the Clones. Yeah. Now, so that's why I started with, for example, that's why I started with Watto, because I knew how to do Watto, and nobody had seen Watto before. So he was a great character, and he was in the middle of the movie. You never want to start with the first characters in a film ever. So it was a great scene. It was him out in the junkyard with Qui-Gon. So those were the very first shots we did, and I think in doing those shots, we demonstrated to George that we could act, that we could be inspired by someone like Andy Secombe doing the voice, and we could bring our own acting to it. And I think that's what happened over the life of Phantom Menace, which led into the further films, where George gave us more acting opportunities. And I think that's also was, it would have been John Knoll who was making the decisions early on before I got involved in the film about, how they were going to tackle Jar Jar. And why they'd chosen the suit was because, George wanted to have Ahmed's performance on the screen, his physical performance on the screen, but he wanted him to be an otherworldly character.
with the shape of his neck and head, and therefore it couldn't be someone in a rubber suit. And I know that George, I think this is my theory, but that the idea was to sort of step partially away from people inside suits to make the characters more exotic. And certainly the battle droids, there was no way you could have anyone in the suit, right? They were designed, I think, almost on purpose by Doug Chiang, so you couldn't have someone in the suit. So those were always going to be animated, but they didn't have any facial expressions, and we ended up motion capturing them as well.
So, as an animator, I'm wondering what sort of animation did you look at for inspiration as you're supervising the animation of these characters in Star Wars?
I actually didn't look at animation. What I looked at was live action. And what I was trying to get the animators to concentrate on is what do we as people, as audience members, as human beings, what do we see when we're looking at a loved one talking to us, or a stranger who's walked up to us, or in a movie, an actor who is listening and responding to another actor in the scene. And I remember early on, it was about getting them to think about what actors think about all the time. That, yes, there was the whole technology side of it, and I had to be over top of that. But to raise our game in the animation group, I felt we needed to be better actors. And so that was where I spent a lot of my time, was trying to get the animators to think about that these characters have to be believable on screen for our audience, that the audience has to believe that they're alive, that they're thinking, that they're emoting, that they're listening. So like when Watto's listening to, what are you, some kind of Jedi? He's got an attitude to him. He's got a swagger to him. So we looked, like, for characters like that, we looked at, old films like what was that? Like Oliver with the character of Fagin and stuff. We looked at those kind of characters. I remember we were studying Casablanca. There's the German guy, Strasser, I think is his name. In particular, Miguel Fuertes, who was the lead on Sebulba, was looking at him and the way that actor. I'm forgetting his name. We can look it up later. Anyways, how he, in the scene when he's talking to them, he's not blinking. And so Miguel had come and pitched me the idea, and looking at this footage of, what if we did something like this with Sebulba? It gives a great deal of intensity when you're not blinking. So we did that. And then he studied another film called, I think it was just called Freaks, actually, from the 1930s, which had a circus performer. I'm just looking it up online while we're here. Had a circus performer who walked on their hands, and he used that as inspiration on how Sebulba would walk around. I also remember Miguel looking at the English Patient, and there's a scene, I think it was cut out of the movie actually. It's on the deleted scenes. There's a Bedouin or someone, a guy out in the desert, and he had these great mannerisms. And so we would look at that footage and say, okay, well, what are the choices, either conscious or unconscious, that people or actors are making, and how can we layer that kind of nuance into our work? Yeah, so it was a film called Freaks, 1932, directed by Todd Browning. There's a character in that has no legs, and he walks on his hands, and that was the inspiration for how Sebulba would walk around.
So, in interviews that I've done with Dave Filoni, he'd say that talking to George about Star Wars is always talking about other movies that aren't Star Wars at all. Is that sort of the language that you spoke to him with then?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I would talk to George, like between takes, and this is over the 3 films, and I, got more comfortable sitting and talking to George as the years went on. But yes, a lot of what we would talk about as new characters came in, I would say, well, George, what is this, what's your inspiration for this character? And he'd say, oh, it's Donald Pleasance out of this film, or it's this actor. You should go off and see this movie if I hadn't seen it already. And I think, just going back to your very first question, I think that's one of the reasons I was able to connect with George, was because I do love movies. I've seen a lot of movies. I went to film school. I know about film history. And so I was able to talk to him and respond to that part of him as a lover of movies, and him working with me on what we call every character has a backstory. It may not be explicitly written in the script, but every character comes into the scene, and there's things like I get the animators to think about, like, do their feet hurt? Do they have a good sleep last night? Are they hungry? Are they irritated by what they're having to deal with? And so we would talk about all of those things, as we moved into Watto or Jar Jar or Sebulba or any the other animated characters we were doing in Phantom. We were talking about backstory. Where have they been? Like, as they walk onto the scene, where have they been? What have they been doing? I think one of the things that lifted our animation was that we were thinking about that. We were talking about that. You get extra nuance and layered performances instead of just walking on like wooden and just say the lines and then walk off. Because that's not how real people work. We bring baggage. We bring history with us. So getting the animators to think about that, that was my approach, and that continues to be my approach to this day. And working with my animators here, I'm always getting them to think about that. I can't honestly say we're really about subtext back then, but I was talking to them about, where have they been? What do they want? Every actor, when they're in a scene, needs to answer the question, what does my character need or want from this scene? And that's what I'm trying to get the animators to do too.
Is there a particular moment of animation, of character animation, in Phantom Menace that you are particularly proud of, and how did you get to it?
It's a great question, and it actually, just off the top of my head, honestly, it's that scene in the junkyard with Watto, and it was the first scene we did. And the reason it stands out for me is because we got to a place that I could imagine in my mind's eye, and we got there pretty quickly, and it gave me confidence that we would be able to climb this mountain that you and I talked about earlier. I think if I hadn't had the early success with that character, I would have been in a much, more precarious position. Even that said, though, I do remember that I had serious insomnia in the early production of that film, to the point where I wasn't sure I was going to be able to finish the film because I was so freaked out, because I kept thinking about the millions of fans out there who'd been waiting for this film, and I wasn't sure that I was worthy of the task. And I was worried about what they were all thinking. So I remember driving up to Skywalker Ranch and asking to see George, and I sat down and I told him about my condition and where I was, and I said, I'm worried about all these people. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, all these people, they've been waiting. He went, you need to make one person happy. One person. And that person's me. And I went, right. And he went, and I'm happy. I think you guys are doing a great job. So you need to not stop worrying about the world, and you need to just continue working with me and making me happy. I'm like, oh, okay. Thanks, George. Okay. I drove back down, and I slept like a baby that night because he just reset me. I was like, oh, right, of course. I'd lost the plot there. I'd lost the fact that, even though I was doing the work he wanted, I was started to freak out about, theaters full of people who were going to be judgmental of what we were doing. So anyway.
I'm curious about, there were, I think, far fewer people who were disappointed than maybe people would believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that my suspicion is that it's a myth, but one of the ideas that seemed to take hold was that no one could tell George no. And I'm wondering, I'm sure you've heard that before, right?
Oh, yeah, but, yes, there is a myth. But I can tell you, and the reason I'm laughing is because I remember a day when we were sitting in the main theater at ILM, the Red Theater, and I would always sit 2 seats to the side of George, and then we all had John had his particular seat, which is sort of in front of George, and then the producers were around us, and then the support people were behind us. And yes, George would say stuff in that theater, and he'd come up with crazy ideas. And I remember this one day, I don't remember particularly what he said, but he said, oh, well, we should do this. And I didn't even have time to think. I just turned and went, no, we're not doing that. And there was an intake of air in the theater. People were like, oh! that I dared to say no. And George turned to me and I could see him lit from the screen, right? So I could see the side of his face, and he kind of smiled and he said, well, do you have a better idea? And I said, not at this moment, but I'll come back with a better idea or a good idea. So just give me the time. He went, all right, okay. I think that moment, and that happened on Phantom Menace, I think that moment actually earned me some respect with George. I think it was more that people were terrified to say no, but it wasn't that George wouldn't react to it, because I lived through that example, I came out the other side. There's famous stories of George saying, oh, I thought the door was going to be over here when they were building the ranch, and then he'd come back and they'd move the door, and he was like, why'd you move the door? He said, well, you said that, you thought it was going to be over here. It's like, no, I just thought it was going to be over there. I don't know if that's a fictional story, but that was a story that was told to us. We were told, there in the early days, you weren't to speak to George. You were, it's not to, let him do his thing and move through his space without bothering him and all that. Truthfully, very, very few people. George, walks around in Marin County, goes out for dinner at local restaurants. Nobody bothers him. Everyone gives him his space. There's no problem.
So one thing I'm curious about, it's something, if my voicemail didn't tip you off, I actually am a big fan. Yes. There's again, watching the discourse about the characters and Jar Jar in specific, I'm wondering on your perspective of the idea that, there were some people, and I think they were an older generation, and I talked to Tara Whitletch about it actually for this piece, and she said George knew he was going to be divisive, but one thing I never saw in any of that criticism was that they said they didn't like Jar Jar, but no one ever said he looked fake.
Yes.
Or that they didn't
I'm glad you. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. So I have a story related exactly to that. So in the production of Phantom Menace, Jar Jar wasn't my favorite character, but I was working for George Lucas on a Star Wars film. Who was I to question? And he was completely committed to that character, so I was completely committed to George. But it wasn't a huge surprise that there was some backlash, because George had certainly, I remember George saying, look, this character's for the youngest members of the audience. The new people, the new kids are going to be, this will be their first Star Wars film. He said this is specifically for them. And if I remember correctly, he had even called that some of the older fans were not going to respond well, and he didn't care. He was making it for his own kids and for the kids around the world. So then fast forward to the New York City premiere of the film, where all the press from around the world, both domestic and international, had assembled for what we call a press junket. Films do it all the time. I had been asked to be the representative for ILM and went to New York with George, and the actors were there and everything. And it was in the series of interviews that it started to be clear to me that the press were not favoring Jar Jar. And reviewer after reviewer came in and was questioning me about the character, and a lot of them were very negative about it. And so I honestly was kind of down. We busted our butts to make this character, and people were not responding well to it. And at this point, I hadn't met any kids yet, to see the film, because this was all adults going to see the premiere, and then the press writing about it. So the following day, we were flying back to California. I was very nicely, they asked me to go on the George's private jet with him. So I was sitting on this jet, not a big one. It's got 20 seats or something like that. And I was sitting up the front, and he got on the plane with a big, with his publicist and a huge stack of paper. This is 1999, so we didn't have, smartphones and iPads and things like that. So
was that Lynn Hale?
Yeah, it's Lynn Hale.
Okay.
So Lynn was there, and so George sat down at the back of the plane with this huge stack of reviews, and we took off, and I was sort of sitting there kind of glum, and a couple hours into the flight, George waves me back, says, come here, sit down with me. And I was like, okay. And he said, well, what's the matter? You look really upset. And I said, these reviews, they're dreadful. I mean, they hate our work. And he went, whoa. He said, did you read all these? I went, no, I read enough. He said, I've read every single one. He said, what you need to know and what you need to remember is not one review said he doesn't look real. they've treated that character like he was alive and in that movie. Just like, who was that guy in The Fifth Element? What was the guy's name? There was a really irritating character in that. I'm just looking it up.
It was Ruby Rod, played by Chris Tucker.
That's it. So he said they are treating Jar Jar like the Chris Tucker character. You should be incredibly proud. I'm like, what? And he went, Rob, they didn't say he was badly animated. They didn't say he looked fake. They treated him like, they just don't like the character. That's not on you. That's on me, and that's fine with me. I didn't make that character for them. I made it for all the kids around the world. And then he said, I could put you at a card table in any mall of America and put a sign up that says, this is the guy that made Jar Jar, and there would be lines of kids lining up to get your autograph. I went, George, that's not true. Well, fast forward, years later, I was asked to go to Disney World in Florida for one of the Star Wars weekends, and sure enough, hundreds of people lined up and told me how much they liked the character. But that was years later, right? It's like, so he was right, and what you pointed out was nobody said he didn't look real, and nobody said he was animated. They all treated him like he was a real thing.
Is there, Ahmed, maybe last year on Twitter sort of started a bit of a row where he felt like he had, like, the work he did in motion capture and the work you all did in animation with the character sort of gets overlooked in favor of things that sort of came later with Gollum or, that sort of thing. People don't necessarily look to Phantom Menace as the pioneer it really was. And I'm wondering what your reaction is to that and sort of how to correct the record, or to give you a chance to correct that record.
I saw that thread, and I've seen that the path that Ahmed has now gone down, and I was very, very happy. Someone sent me a clip of him at the celebration over the past weekend, and everyone clapping and cheering for him. So I'm very happy for him that that's happening. Truthfully, at the time, we weren't making a big deal about motion capture because we didn't know it was a big deal. I mean, we were on the bleeding edge of technology, and yes, we were finding our way through it, but we didn't, I don't know, I mean, it wasn't something that I felt at the time we needed to herald, and it was, Weta and Peter Jackson and Andy Serkis who came along later, and I think, this is a theory, I don't know, but whether Peter Jackson was trying to get Andy Serkis an Oscar nomination or something, and was promoting that more, and so they conveniently forgot about it. I think also a lot of the adults in the world didn't like Jar Jar, so they didn't want to be reminded of that character. But that's just my opinion,
Uh-huh. How do you feel now? I mean, when was the last time maybe you revisited Phantom Menace? How does that work hold up for you upon your most recent revisit of it? Or have you not even looked at it?
I probably haven't seen it in about 10 years. Look, I'm proud of that work. I think, just memory, I think like the pod race would hold up completely, or pretty well. I mean, that's a real mixture. There's miniatures in there, there's animation, there's people in rubber suits. I think there's I think that's a great sequence. I stand behind the Watto work. You have to, I don't know, I move on in my career and try to be better in each, next show. So I'm sure if I went back and looked at it, I'd be, I'd probably wince a couple of times because of it being 20 years old. But I routinely have people tell me that, that they love the film, that they grew up with the film, that they were young when it came out, that it still resonates with them, and that makes me very happy. I was happy that we were able to, at George's request, go and update Yoda. We did that between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. We went back into Phantom Menace, and I believe that footage is on the Blu-rays of the digital Yoda, and I know that work is superior to anything else we did in Phantom Menace because it was done years later. In fact, it was done after we'd finished Clones, and we'd had a digital Yoda, which we even improved further. So it would stand out about head and shoulders above the other work because it was done years later.
Mm-hmm. What is sort of, as you look back on your experience with Phantom Menace, what's sort of the biggest takeaway that you took that you still use in your career today?
One of the best pieces of advice I got was from Jim Morris, who was the president of ILM at the time, and he said, to be successful in this job, you are going to have to delegate with authority to your team. It's impossible for you to be over everything in this movie. You need to be the general in charge of all of this. You're going to have a massive team. I think I had 65 animators working with me on that film. By nature, I'm a very organized person, so I knew that, but it was more about, delegating, a supervisor for the end battle, for example, and putting particular people on the pod race. That was important to do that, and I continue to this day. I think the role of the animation director is to mentor and guide the lead animators that are working with you, to give them very clear communication about what your expectations are, and to give them the authority to run their animators and not second guess them. Certainly behind closed doors, you can talk about what you're seeing and how you would like the leads to modify the performances, but you can't be you can't be in all places at the same time on a big show like that. So I definitely learned that on the day, and I think that's one of the reasons I survived that film and then was asked back for the next two with George, because I found a balance in presenting our team's work to George, to collaborating with George, and then to guiding the team, but giving them enough creative freedom that they were energized and excited about working on that film.
How did you approach that final battle? You mentioned it earlier that you didn't even have the technology, but how did you finally come through on that? They
finally got me a crowd system, so we were animating all the walks and runs and actions independently, and then those were then attached to, I don't know, nulls or sprites, I don't know what we called them back then, but so we could do the big marching out. We created little tiny vignettes, sort of, 3, 4, 5 characters fighting, so it could be some Gungans against battle droids, and we could then place them into the battlefield, spin them around, and then we could make them look more unique than what that you guys could see when you were watching the movie. There's a finite amount of action there. You just reminded me. So for that, I studied films like I think, Braveheart and stuff like that. And if you really look at, say, Spartacus or Braveheart or any of those big battle sequence movies, and you're honest with yourself and you look at, there isn't, when they're all lining up for battle, there's very little movement. Like there's a spear moving here or there's a horse's head that's moving up and down. But basically, everyone's still. And so I think one of our approaches was to be honest about, well, how much motion do we really need to put in there, rather than moving every single character, which was our initial impulse, which was a wrong impulse because it would be too busy. And because we were being smart about what needed to be animated, we were able to get more footage done per week, per month.
It's definitely the opening of that battle with that Gungan coming out of the mist. Was the first shot that anyone had ever seen of this. Was that nerve-wracking?
That is more of a beautiful lighting and compositing. That was a cycle that had been created. I now sadly forget who animated that with the Gungan on his mount. We would have spent some time on that animation, but then once they placed it in the shot and they had it coming through the mist, that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise when we saw it for the first time in the theater. It was like, wow, that looks so awesome, So that's the joy of working on these huge things, is you're working away, and there's other departments that are doing work that you don't know. Like I love here going to, say, the effects reviews where they're blowing stuff up, or like when we're doing all the Lego films here, Legos all breaking apart, and I just love all that stuff, right? My team doesn't do that. There's a different team. So in the case of the Phantom Menace, there's a whole lighting and compositing team. They're doing their magic, and I wasn't seeing it every day. So then you go into a monthlies where you're looking at all the work, the latest work, and suddenly one of those shots comes up, and you're like, oh, okay, this is going to work. This is amazing.
I can literally talk to you for the next 3 hours. I've got one more question, and I'll let you go because I don't want to take too much more of your time. Again, in that documentary, there was that first screening of the rough cut that George Lucas had shown, and he seemed very nervous about it. I'm wondering if you were there for one of those first screenings of the movie, and what your reaction was the first time you saw that rough cut.
It's a great question. I was there. We were always invited to go see the rough cuts. We tended to do that up at the Stag Theater at Skywalker, which is an amazing THX theater.
It's beautiful.
It is gorgeous. Yeah. So, look, I don't remember where that would have been in the timeline now. I remember that for the longest time, we were really concerned that we weren't going to hit the deadlines. And as I've talked already in this conversation, my worry was that my team wasn't hitting the quality that, George had expectations for. That turned out to be wrong, but I remember there was a huge amount of nervousness. I don't know. George never seemed nervous to me. The only time I ever saw, I'll do it this way, the only time I ever saw George nervous was when we were here in Sydney shooting the Dooku fight. And poor Christopher Lee could barely move. And George was desperate. He was like, this isn't going to work. This is the fight when he takes on Obi-Wan and Anakin. And we had a stunt performer. We had already committed to doing a digital head replacement. I'd already scanned Christopher Lee and photographed Christopher Lee in every expression. That was the only time I saw George agitated and deeply concerned that it wasn't going to work. And I remember being with him on set with Rick McCallum, and I was asked by Rick to sort of calm George down and tell him it was going to be okay. I believed that it was going to be okay, but I wasn't 100% sure. But I remember that was the one and only time that I can recall of seeing George agitated. So I don't remember him agitated. Doesn't mean he wasn't for Phantom Menace, and I'd have to go back and look at that documentary, and it would then probably spark my memory and go, oh, yeah. But George never tests his movies, so it was never going to be seen by anybody other than him and his people very close to him. Like, I do remember going to the final, or the first time we saw the entire film. He had Steven Spielberg with him in the Stag. Rupert Murdoch was there with some of his people in the back. I was there. John Knoll was there. Martin Smith, who edited. Ben Burt was there. Scott Squires would have been there. We were all sitting to see it for the first time with music, the final mix, final picture, final everything. And I remember just, being overwhelmed by the experience because everything had been brought together and I hadn't seen it in that form before. Like, I didn't even hear the sound effects of the pod racers until that screening. Like, I never heard all the unique sounds. So seeing the pod race, I saw the pod race mute forever, month after month after month. So to hear Sebulba's with that sound that it had, that was amazing, So at the end of the screening, we were all sort of ushered out, and George and Stephen were standing there talking about it, and I wanted to hear, right? So I'm standing in the back of the aisle, and George sees me, he waves me down, he says, come on down. So I walked into the aisle, just one in front of them, and he introduced me for the first time to Steven Spielberg. He said, Steven, this is Rob. He was the animation director on the film. And Steven sort of bows and says, the work's absolutely amazing. It's astonishing. And then George sort of put his arm around me. Yeah, Steven, you can't talk to Rob anymore. And we kind of walked out together. And that was sort of I'd reached the top of Everest. I got to a point where George's closest friend had told George that he thought the movie was amazing, that the work that we'd done was amazing, and that was that was the end of that journey for me, and that was just amazing, and a moment I never thought I would ever experience. And then, George then, of course, asked me back for Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, and then we continued to work together on setting up Singapore and the Clone Wars TV show. I loved working with him. I truly did.
I have to say, I was at Celebration over the weekend, and yesterday was that Phantom Menace panel, and I can't even begin to tell you what it felt like to be in a stadium of 7,000 people really appreciating that work.
Yeah. No, I saw that. I wish I could have been there. I'm just too far away. That's my problem. But I hear that they John Knoll was there and Gene Bolte was there. Is that right?
Yeah, and Doug Chang and Matthew Wood from their respective departments, and then and then some of the actors. Ahmed got the standing ovation I think he needed after these last 20 years. Yeah,
I follow him on Twitter, and he said he was overwhelmed, that he was nervous about going to Celebration, but he was overwhelmed by the positive energy, and I think he's loved that he went there for it. So I'm so happy for him. I worked very closely with him, and we collaborated on Phantom, obviously, but also in Attack of the Clones. And what people don't know is that Ahmed was incredibly helpful to me for the Yoda fight, because Ahmed has a background in martial arts, plus he has a deep love of anime, and it was through discussions with Ahmed that he was able to help me understand or help me find a path in working out the Yoda Dooku fight. So I have a huge warm spot for Ahmed and a huge respect for him as a performer and as a person. So I was very, very happy and pleased. I've got friends who are sending me stuff and going, you should see this, you got to look at this, Ahmed's being taught, he got a standing ovation, and here's his interview, and they send me links to the videos. So I was very happy to see that. Well,
I'll let you go. Thank you so much, not just for talking to me, but your work on, in the Star Wars universe, as it means so much to so many people, as you can imagine, that they're still calling you 20 years later to try to. I
know. Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad to help you out with this.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad the phone didn't have any more problems.
I know, me too. I was sorry that we had to go through that, but anyways, we worked it out, or it worked itself out, so that's good.
Indeed. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, you too. Thanks. Bye.
So yeah, a lot of great anecdotes in there. I really love hearing these, and hope I'm able to get more. I just love collecting these, and really love getting to share them with you. So as far as I'm concerned, Rob Coleman deserves all that credit and gets to do that. If you want to keep up with me, you can go to swankmatron.com and keep up with all of my doings. I've got some books coming out soon, and just keep busy that way. Or if you want to keep up with Full of Sith, you can go to fullofsith.com and listen to the entire back catalog of episodes we have, and do that. You can send us an email at fullofsith.com or holocron at fullofsith.com, and be sure to rate and review the show wherever it is you listen to it. We'd really love to to hear you do that. And you can watch it on YouTube now, actually. If you look up Full of Sith on YouTube, you can watch it there, if that's how you like listening to your podcasts, or find them that way. And so for super producer Mike Pilot and for Holly Fry, who should be back next week with me, fingers crossed. I'm Bryan Young, and the Force will be with you always.
Sir, if you'll not be meeting me, I'll close down for a while.